ビッグヤバいかも。
Big yabai?
ビッグヤバい。
The knight and king all alone with 3 pawns.
We're fucked! やばいよ。
You're approaching me, Pika.
King versus king だよ。タンタンタラタタタタタタタン。
Hello everybody and welcome to a game from Grandmaster Ninomae Inanis-chan, as well as from International Master, who is it again? Pikamee. Yes. These are very well-known Grandmasters, and they are very good at chess, as you will see in this upcoming match this is from June 2021, the Worldwide Classics Tournament, and we have a fairly standard opening here. This is a Queen's Pawn opening. This isn't exactly the Queen's Gambit, but you can convince yourself that it sort of looks similar, so it's probably a very high-level game. So we have an immediate counter in the center with e4. This is not recommended because the pawn is indeed hanging. You can just take it, but that doesn't happen. Instead, Ninomae Inanis-chan decides to develop a knight instead. And now the problem with this move is it's too weak. The knight can be kicked away by the pawn, and there is no problem for black here. Instead, Pikamee decides to go for c5. This is like a sort of reverse Queen's Gambit, except there's a knight here, and now you have 3 pawns that are all super weak. So Inanis capitalizes on this immediately, capturing in the center. And now Pikamee decides that she has become a fan of the Bone Cloud, as she plays King e7. This is a very high level technique, usually reserved for super grandmasters, but everybody's playing it nowadays, so I guess it's fine if an international master tries it too. So Inanis drops her knight back to g4, where you might notice it's under attack by the bishop, but it's actually defended by a tactic. And the tactic is actually there is no tactic, she just misses that's a hanging knight. Anyway, on the next move, Inanis brings the knight back to e2 or e3, where it is safe, and now the game just continues, where if you just look at the position, white has all of the advantage. I mean, there's still castling rights. I mean, you can say that both sides have developed a piece, but yeah, this is not very good looking for black. So the knight is developed, that's great and all, but your center is looking very weak still. This pawn on c5 is now under attack. And so let's see how the game develops now. h3, this makes sense, preventing the knight from going to g4, not like that square was defended by the knight or anything anyway. So the knight comes to e4. Now, you might notice this is a very active square. For the knight, you'd rather get rid of it as soon as possible, and Inanis chooses to do exactly that with the move f3. Now, if you've ever heard of Grandmaster Benjamin Feingold, he will say never play f3, and there is very good reason for this. As you see, all of these pawns are now on light squares, meaning all of the dark squares around the king are super weak. If you can get the piece onto those dark squares, then it's going to be very annoying to deal with and very hard to remove. So the best move in this position is to go to knight to g3 and attack the rook, attack the bishop. However, in this situation, you wouldn't even want to capture the bishop, because I mean, look at this pawn structure. This bishop is never moving. So, yes, so this is an amazing opportunity, which of course, she decides that the most important thing is undoing the Bone Cloud. She realizes it's too high level a strategy for her, so she just goes back and loses the knight. But don't worry, it is worth it, because now the king is back in a safe zone. So now there is a lot of tension in the center. Pawns, just lots of pawns that are attacking each other. Now, if we go back a couple moves ago, this was always possible, but I guess the purpose, besides undoing the bone cloud, was also to indirectly reinforce the center here. So that was a good foresight by Pikamee. So now we have c4, which is gambiting a center pawn for absolutely no reason. And it is not taken because, as I said before, there is compensation for the lost knight. That is the dark square weaknesses here. If this move were to come immediately, then the king would have to go to d2, which is not a square the king wants to go to. So this is actually reinforced, so that if the bishop comes here, then the knight can come back to block. There is a slight problem with this idea though, which is that e3 is going to attack the pinned knight, and it will very likely be lost in this position, if not for the fact that the bishop covers that square. So this is very good for white still, and black is going to have to make up a lot for the lost piece. So captures in the middle, very good. You're gaining a strong center, and even though black is down a piece, it isn't really felt that much because black's center is so strong with all these pawns controlling white's development. You can see that this bishop is never gonna move. None of these pieces have moved. It's looking fairly balanced for as strange a position as it is. So the knight comes here, obviously with the attack on the queen, and unfortunately National Master Pikamee must have been sleeping and played the knight move instead, accidentally blundering the queen. So not even a take back on the next move, instead knight to d8, which accomplishes it blunders a pawn as well as not recapturing this knight. So you have no idea what's going on here. So the knight retreats, of course, you don't want to lose it if you don't have to. And the next move, yes, bishop to e6, targeting this pawn. However, for the time being it is defended. At some point you might want to play f6 and then capture on c4, but that's not an option because it's not your turn. So a5, inducing a massive weakness on the dark squares, even on the queen side. So this is not capitalized. Instead we get f5. So f5 is not the worst move in the world because it does strengthen the center, and the center will it will prove slightly annoying to Inanis' development. So we've got a rook lift on the queen side, which you might notice blunders a rook, or rather an exchange, but this is fine because Inanis is up a queen, so this blunder does not matter very much. Instead, Pikamee decides that she's down material, she has to keep pieces on the board, does not go for the trade, and instead brings the rook to f8 to defend the pawn. Now the rook is moved to a more active square where it targets this pawn on g7, and there is still, you can still savage this position by playing something like g6 or pretty much anything that defends this pawn. Instead, Pikamee decides to capture the pawn on c4, not noticing that the pawn is protected. However, you might notice in this position, there is actually a very strong move. Bishop h4. This move is strong because it pins the rook to the king. But not only that, you're going to want to play f4. And the point of f4 is you take the rook for free on the next move. And you cannot capture because that square is protected by your own rook. So unfortunately this tactic was missed, and we have bishop takes on c4, which is guarded by the knight. So of course captures, and we have a very nice indirect defense of this knight by Inanis, opening up the center, finally making use of that light squared bishop which has been trapped the entire game. So we have a b5 attacking the knight, and instead of saving the knight, we go for the opponent's king, which normally is a good idea, except for the fact that it's not a good idea. So the knight is captured in the incorrect way. The correct way would be that captures with pawn. However, captures with rook is not worst, because you can still recapture the bishop afterwards, because yes, white forgot to take this pawn. Instead, by Inanis, we have a exchange sacrifice for this bishop. I mean, if you knew, sure, that was the strong bishop that could have given Inanis troubles, so she just chooses not to worry about it and sacrifice the rook for it. Now, this move is interesting. Instead of immediately capturing the rook, the idea behind this move is that you want to play bishop to b4 at some point to x-ray the rook on f8. Now this move does not work right now because it would be captured. So you would probably want to capture the rook first. And if we watch, this is another possibility, is that the rook is now out of space on this rank. It has to move back, and once it does, it loses control of the b4 square, and the rook here will be lost. Instead, Pikamee goes for not saving the rook, but in fact a tactic against the bishops, actually. In this position, the threat of taking on d2 with check is too much, so you have to capture this pawn. You don't have time to capture the rook. However, Grandmaster Ninomae Inanis captures the rook anyway and falls for the trap. Now both bishops are lost instead of just one. So recapture with the queen, and Pikamee seems to forget the follow-up, which would have been capturing the bishop, and instead pushes a pawn to attack the queen instead. Now, the problem with this is that it's just a bad move. You just gambit the pawn for no reason, and okay, you still have to capture this bishop. Okay, she does, good. And now h5. I suppose that's a fine move. I mean, there is not much hope for black. Black is just down a queen, and this is a losing endgame. She's down a pawn as well. Pikamee has lost almost all hope. So knight to c3. This is the first time that knight is moving. So finally, Inanis has started her development. Now, yes, at this point in the game, I remember that Pikamee said that she just noticed that she had a rook and decided to move it. So, good for you, Pikamee. And now, in this position, just capturing this pawn on a7 is very good. You get 2 pass pawns of your own, and both are going to promote. You just have to be wary that after king moves, you will be under fire. So just move to a safe square like b6, and you will be absolutely fine. So Inanis attacks the pawn on a7 with the knight instead, which is absolutely fine. There is very little that black can do in order to guard this pawn. Then the rook could do it if the king moved out of the way, but this knight is just not going to get there in time. So Pikamee decides to protect the pawn by pushing it, which does not actually protect it, it just turns this into a fork now. Instead, Inanis plays h4, which I don't know what the point of that was. These pawns weren't going to make very much progress anyway. So now, Pikamee accidentally forces Inanis to discover this idea of the fork on her own by attacking the queen. So this happens oh, whoa, no, you're supposed to take the pawn here. Okay, this move is almost pointless. You will see in a couple moves this will be justified. However, that also just loses a queen. I mean, you can't have your idea be to fork this and then you just don't take it and instead lose your queen. This move does accomplish something in a few moves, however, for the time being, just losing your queen is not a good idea. So we have a trade on a7, king moves. Now, it's going to be very difficult to hold on to these pawns as well as this one. So I think in this position, an active move with the knight, so that you can prevent the opponent's knight from getting to c6. You want to prevent your opponent from making it to the square so that it defends the pawn on a5. If you lose that pawn, then your opponent has 2 passed pawns on the queen side and it's all over. Now, in order to get your knight over there while keeping your structure together, you need to play king to f5 to defend this pawn so that it is not a target and your knight is free to move. So Ninomae plays a waiting move. This also brings it to a rank where it can access the rest of the board. And this is not that important as for the time being, as she has a different plan in mind. So knight moves back, gambitting this pawn here for absolutely no reason. But instead Ninomae chooses to trade pawns instead. It is absolutely fine in a winning endgame like this that you trade pawns. And in fact, just sacrificing the rook for the knight at this point will actually leave white probably in a winning endgame. So we'll go one move further. At this point it is completely impossible to save this pawn on a5. The knight is already on it. There is no saving it. So king to h8. This is Pikamee's way of saying I resign. But instead we have a knight. We have knight to e7. Now we could have some interesting variation where king comes to this square, rook comes to this square, king goes back, checkmate. I would have loved to see that in the game, but sadly this is not what happened. Instead, we have c5, and now this is, yes, Pikamee plays this move king h8 anyway, and it seems that we are going to get the promotion at some point. Now the threat will be that once you promote, the king is going to be stuck on these two squares. So if you can time it right, while the king is still on h8, you can bring the rook here, king moves, promote, and then it's stalemate. Instead, we have this sacrifice that I was talking about before. This is the rook for the knight sacrifice, and in this position, it is actually the best move. During the game, Inanis said that it was a mistake, but she did not see the continuation. If she just continues to push her pawn, the black king is too late to stop it. However, this is not what happened in the game. Instead, we got knight to f5 check. Now, if you are a fan of Grandmaster Benjamin Feingold, you might say that knight f5 should always be played if it is an option. However, it is incorrect, because in this position, it just gives black enough time to run away and stop this pawn from promoting. White is just too slow. So now we have a interesting move by Grandmaster Inanis, which is knight to e7, gambiting the knight in order to promote. And no, this is not Hikaru Nakamura. She will not promote to a knight because it is check. She will promote to a queen because she is sane. And so the correct move in this situation would be to take the pawn. However, National Master Pikamee has actually calculated this position and has decided that she is losing anyway, so she decides not to take the pawn either. And so we have a promotion to a queen, and she decides also not to take the knight for some reason. Now a check is given, the king moves, and then the other king moves. At this point, Inanis is saying, "Oh, you are approaching me," and cuts off access to the third rank. Now, if the queen was able to, the queen would love to come right here and check. However, that is defended by black's pawn, so we need some extra maneuvering until that is possible. So his king moves and the queen moves, not to b4 but to b5, because Grandmaster Inanis does not blunder queens very often. Now there are only two legal moves for Pikamee, that are these two. If you go into the corner, you are going to get checkmated faster than this game went to hell, but she went this way instead. So now the idea is to go queen to this square and push this way, or you can play queen here, and then after king moves, play queen here, and now black's king is trapped in the corner. However, this is not what happens. Instead, we just captured all these pawns, cornered the king, give a few checks, and start advancing this pawn. Now, this pawn is completely cut off from the king, so there is no way for Pikamee to stop queening at this point, so she just tries her best to run away. Now, in this position, you need to be very careful with the queens on the board. You've got to notice which squares are being controlled by which pieces. In fact, it might be a good idea at this point to just sacrifice this knight and maybe even this pawn on a4, just so that you get a clear idea in your mind of which squares are being covered by what. So we have this queen check. This is fine. In endgame, giving checks is a sure way to never stalemate. So if we have king to c5, this is a good move, because look at which squares around the king are covered. The knight covers these, the pawn covers this, this queen covers this diagonal. If white just played the passing move, this would be the only option. So all of these squares are covered, so the only way that you could stalemate at this point is to play something like queen e6 or maybe queen e4 in order to take away this square. Then you would stalemate. Of course, Ninomae Inanis is a grandmaster. She does know how to checkmate in this scenario, which would be the simple ladder mate. Very obvious checkmating pattern. However, she plays... Damn it.